students. This is Dr. Nimi Singh from SGTP Khalsa College, University of Delhi, presenting this episode on behalf of Ritu Sharma, Assistant Professor, Sanchi University of Buddhist Indic Studies, Bhopal. I am delighted to present this lecture on Naxalism, which is taught in BA first year. Let us start with the introduction of this topic. Democracy has been hailed as a true and authentic voice of people working for both their tangible and intangible interests. In a meaningful democracy, political stability and working within the conventional framework of law and ethics are the two most desired virtues. People across continents have long cherished the dream of living under healthy governance, which has led to their reaffirming the mandate for constitutionally approved governments irrespective of their efficiency levels or experience. Sometimes there is a limit to all that people can brook. Their faith in legal system fails then. The popular government becomes a toy in the hands of industrial bogies and capitalist entrepreneurs. They lose the power to govern even the aspects of their own lives, and there is a sense of simmering anarchy. This is not a passing mood. It has been born out of a strong sense of being wronged and alienated amidst their land and property. Naxalism, expression of socio-economic view, law and order problem. The year was 1967, the place Naxalbari. The young and fiery ideologies of the Marxist Leninist movement in India formed the CPI-ML, envisioning a spontaneous mass upsurge all over India that would create a liberated zone. The Naxalite movement was thus born. The credit for the survival of the movement for over 40 years must go to the government, which has failed abysmally in addressing the causes and conditions that sustain the movement. The problem has been in the Indian state's perception of the causes of the Naxal movement. Students, in this chapter, we shall explain Naxalism with the help of following modules. Government's perspective on Naxalism, origin of Naxal movement, tackling Naxalism, the laws made by the government, and in the end we will conclude. Students, let us start with a detailed discussion of each of the mentioned topics one by one in our coming modules. When the Naxal uprising began in 1967, the Indian government looked at it as a law and order problem. It actually did not realize the causes of the movement and the extent of mobilization of people. Hence, it believed that it could and would put an end to it in a short span of time using force. During the outbreak of the armed clashes in Naxalbari, the then Home Minister Y.B. Chavan, addressing the Lok Sabha on June 13, 1967, described them as mere lawlessness, a transgression to be repressed and contained. So, while Charu Majumdar named the 1970s the decade of liberation, the Indian state chose to make it the decade of repression. The United Front government in West Bengal, confronted by the Naxal violence, was in a dilemma about the nature and scope of its response. It recognized the crucial need to address the problem of monstrous inequity. As a government, it could not let any violent uprising threaten its legitimacy, even if the cause was morally valid. The government chose to react based on the latter point, and so launched a massive police operation that drove the movement underground and brought most of its leaders under police custody within 4 months of the uprising. The emergency in 1975 was a period of carte blanche to the state authority to crush the movement. It leads to the legitimization of violation of human rights by the state. But ironically, the movement arose again in a more violent form after the emergency. Police excesses like extrajudicial killings and extortions, misappropriation and harassment of the Naxal support base are public secrets, which governments have turned a blind eye to. The governments have enacted several laws to empower themselves to combat Naxals. The West Bengal government enacted the West Bengal Act 1970, which is the prevention of violent activities, to arm itself to repress the uprising. No particular national act has been enacted so far specifically to counter the Naxal movement, but various anti-terror acts have been used to curb Naxal violence and too often to target sympathizers by stamping them as Naxalites. This trend was followed in several other states also. For instance, in Andhra Pradesh in 1983, the N.T. Rama Rao government even liberalized arms licensing to enable people to protect themselves from Naxals. However, in spite of the government's muscle power and legal teeth, the Naxal movement has continued to spread its base because the rural poor and oppressed identify with its ideology. In other words, its inception, ideology, spread and sustenance are deeply rooted in socio-economic factors. Students, in this module, we have seen how government's efforts backfired and Naxalism spread in India. I am ending this module here and we shall discuss the Now, the Naxalite movement came into being as a result of prevailing social and economic issues. In fact, while conducting an inquiry into the uprising, the West Bengal State Secretariat of the CPIM stated, "Behind the peasant unrest in Naxalbari lies a deep social malady, a malified transfers, evictions and other anti-people actions of tea gardeners and jotedars. These issues were long standing and there was no dearth of reform legislation, but the spirit of law remained confined to paper and the people were left to languish. Therefore, it recognized that the causes were in a sense socio and economic. All the regions in which the Naxal movement took hold are ones with alarming levels of poverty. In Telangana, in the districts of Karimnagar, Adilabad and Warangal, poverty was 95.8%, while in the rest of the state it was between 50 and 60%. After independence, the Indian government pursued agricultural policies focused on massively improving output without doing enough to check economic and social disparity. With the commercialization of agriculture, economic disparities widened. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. The attempt of the government to abolish zamindari created a class of rich peasants from the backward classes. With the spread of communist ideology, there was a greater mobilization of the sharecroppers, that is, bargadars and landless laborers, who mostly belong to the so-called lower castes and tribes. This polarized the agrarian classes and created an environment of confrontation. Now, let us see what the reasons were behind the origin of Naxal movements. The first one was social inequity and exploitation. The oppressed classes were not only exploited as sharecroppers and landless laborers by the landlords, they also fall prey to moneylenders. The groups constituting the sharecroppers and the landless laborers wanted a new social order with equity, and the landed classes wanted to retain the prestige and status that was associated with the zamindars under the old system. Also in India, since there wasn't any distinction between class and caste relationships at that time, class conflict was manifested as caste conflict. The manifestations of the caste struggle as part of the Naxal movement is actually region specific. In Srikakulam, a government sponsored study noted that chronic poverty and destitution have become the patterns of tribal life. Then comes the alienation of forest land. Alienation of tribal land was a major issue that crippled their economic welfare. This was evident in good measure in the Srikakulam Naxal movement. By the time of the uprising, only 1/3 of the tribals owned land. Alienation happened largely because of the moneylenders' trap, but also because of the government's restrictions of access to forest land, traditionally the exclusive domain of the tribes. In implementing government regulations on forest access, government officials resorted to harassment of the tribals. Loss of access to forest produce, which has constituted a significant part of their income and was also an integral part of their way of life, led to deep discontentment among the tribes. The people who were most affected by the status quo, therefore, were the fuel for the Naxalist fire. Then is the rural reasons, tribals and agricultural laborers. The policies of the state actually disturbed the equilibrium in tribal society. This social structure was also more conducive to mass mobilization. In West Bengal, the basis of the Naxals at Naxalbari, Fenisi, Dioa and Kharibari were mainly inhabited by the Santhal, Oraon and Rajbanshi tribes. They were the hardest hit by the agricultural commercialization and the government's forest policy. They also bore the brunt of social oppression. Their egalitarian social organization was very conducive to mass mobilization. The landless everywhere shared the same woes. The Naxal cadres also hailed from the classes of agricultural workers, sharecroppers and tenants. The next is the urban middle class youth. The Naxalist movement found enormous support among the educated youth. These young men and women belonged to the petty bourgeois. Many of the young Naxalites who went off to the forest were medical and engineering graduates. Universities became hotbeds of radical ideology. Some went to rural areas to mobilize the people there, and some stayed back in Calcutta, perpetrating acts of violence in an attempt to overthrow the state. Ironically, they were precisely the section of the student community who were the most difficult to bring into any kind of student movement and struggle. Their sense of disillusionment and the fiery idealism of youth directed them to Naxalist ideology. The repression of Naxalism during the emergency also attracted a large number of youth to Naxalism as a rebellious action to the government's oppression. Naxalism appealed to each of these groups for different reasons. Students, In this module, we have discussed about the origin of Naxal movement and the main reasons behind its origin. The government has actually constituted an empowered group of ministers to counter the problem of Naxalism, headed by the Home Minister and select chief ministers. The government, under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967, embedded in 2004, has banned the Communist Party of India, Marxist Leninist, People's War and all its associated formations, and the Maoist Communist Center and its front organizations. The government has also constituted a task force which will comprise of nodal officers from the Naxal affected areas and officers from the IB, SSB and the CRPF. There is also a coordination center that was set up in 1998, headed by the Union Home Minister, with chief secretaries and DGPs of the Naxal affected areas for the coordination of the steps taken to control Naxal activities. The government has laid down a clear plan to tackle the left-wing extremism. It has formulated a two-pronged strategy to solve the problem of Naxalism. Let's look into both of them one by one. We will start with law and order approach. Modernizing the police force was an important step in this approach. The government has launched a police modernization scheme in the areas which are affected by Naxal movements. Under this scheme, huge sums of money have been provided to the state governments by the central government to modernize their equipment and tactical gear, including latest communication, vehicles and infrastructure facility. States have also been told to determine police stations and outposts that are susceptible to Naxal attacks and have to be fortified. Due to increased use of IED by the Naxalites and the increased number of casualties, the government has now decided to provide the forces with mine protected vehicles. Central paramilitary forces have been deployed on a long-term basis by the government to help the state governments to fight against the Naxals. The government has also raised a special force of 14,000 personnel consisting of central paramilitary forces, state police and ex-servicemen from areas which are affected by Naxalism. At present, battalions of central paramilitary forces are deployed in Naxalite affected areas. The government, to strengthen the security network in the states, has set up the Indian Reserve battalions. These forces, along with providing additional security, provide youth with employment opportunities. In order to ensure that the activities by the Nepalese Maoists don't affect India, SSB has been deployed along the Indo-Nepal border. Presently, 76 districts in 9 states which are badly affected by the Naxal activities are covered in this scheme. Next, we will look into the social integration approach. Social economic development was a main focus of this approach. The government started the Backward Districts initiative in 2003-2004 and the Backward Regions Grant Fund, under which 55 of the worst affected areas in 9 states were to be provided with funds to the tune of rupees 2,475 crores to tackle the problem of Naxalism. Around 250 districts have been included the BRGF scheme to accelerate socio-economic development in these districts, which is to be administered by the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. Various state governments have allocated funds to the areas affected by Naxalism. The government also requested the Planning Commission to include other Naxal affected areas under the scheme of Backward Regions Grant Funds, for which rupees 5,000 crores have been set apart. Various schemes launched by the government like the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which offers a tremendous opportunities for rural road connectivity. For certain districts which are affected by Naxalism, which have a population of almost 500 and above in plain areas and 250 and above in tribal areas, 3 years perspective plans are being formulated to cover all habitations. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Program is being implemented in 330 districts affected by Naxalism so as to universalize the demand-driven program for wage employment. Other schemes which are in addition to the above mentioned schemes are Bharat Nirman, National Rural Health Mission, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, Integrated Child Development Services and other income generating and social security schemes of the Ministry of Rural Development, Agriculture, Panchayati Raj and Tribal Affairs. The central government will also provide 100% assistance in the formation of ashram schools and hostels for girls and boys in tribal areas. Students, after studying about the strategy to solve the problem of Naxalism, it is now time to know about some of the laws which have been made by the government to tackle Naxalism. Now, the first law made by the government was Rehabilitation and Resettlement Policy 2007. The main aim of this act is to minimize the displacement of people and to promote non-displacing or least displacing alternatives. The government issued a rehabilitation policy on 11th October 2007 for the easy displacement of people who lose their land for industrial growth. Under this policy, land in change for land will be given, job perspective to at least one member of the family, vocational training and housing benefits including houses to people in rural areas and urban areas will be some of the benefits. The second law made by the government was Forest Rights Act 2006. The scheduled tribe and other traditional forest dwellers, Recognition of Forest Rights Acts 2006 or the Forest Rights Act recognizes the rights of the scheduled tribes and forest dwellers who have been living in the forest for years, but their rights have still not been recognized. The Ministry of Environment and Forest has also allowed use of 1 hectare of land for non-forest purposes also and for conversion of kacha roads into pakka roads. The third law made by the government was Chattisgarh Special Public Securities Act 2006. This bill provides definition of unlawful activities, declaring an organization unlawful, formation of an advisory board wherever the state government feels the need for its establishment, procedure of the formation of the advisory board, action of the advisory board, penalties with punishments even for not committing a crime, the power to notify a place being used for unlawful activities and taking occupation of such place thereof and revision of bar against intervention by the courts. After studying all these laws, a question comes in our minds: are these laws effective? These laws have in many ways caused a lot of problems to the tribals and the scheduled caste by negating the spirit of the various safeguards available to the scheduled tribes under the constitution and other laws of the country. The act providing land for land has become a nightmare for the government and has become a stumbling block for ensuring industrialization. As per the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the government has banned all organizations that have any connections with any Naxal movements like the MCC or the CPIM, Marxist-Leninist. There was no need of this bill to tackle Naxalism. This bill was formulated only to silence the appropriate discord and the dissent brewing in the minds of people in the areas which are affected by the Naxalism due to persistent ignorance by the government to their situation. This bill has also failed to make a distinction between the anti-social, anti-national elements from the people who are peace-loving. So, if the laws didn't serve the purpose, which approach is better? The approach which will solve the problem of Naxalism is the social integration. The tribals and the scheduled castes that live in the Naxal affected areas have been neglected for the past many decades and now want some attention from the government, providing them with incentives like giving them right over the forest produced from the forest in which they have been living for generations, providing them with houses, etc., is the right modus of solving their basic problem. The main reason for the spread of Naxalism is the exploitation of poor and scheduled caste only. The main thing which has to be done is to enforce land ceiling laws, utilization of the funds provided to the government to the maximum and political expediency, use of police force should be to enforce the land ceiling laws, evict landlords and ensure land to the farmers for cultivation. They should be provided with police protection and proper rehabilitation for the people who have been displaced should be ensured. Security as well as development has to run hand in hand to counter the Naxal problem. The following steps ought to be taken by the government. Ensure the safety of the civilians by stopping the Salva Judum campaign and ensuring that no counter-insurgency measures are taken by risking the lives of the civilians. Checking instances of human rights violation by the security forces and the Salva Judum. Registering the crimes perpetrated by the security forces, Salva Judum and Maoist and bringing them to justice. Banning of Bal Mandal, the child division of Naxalized, with immediate effect. Ensuring safety of those who surrendered and those who lived in campus or were related with Salva Judum activities. Using force against the tribals to deter them from joining the Naxals has and will backfire against the government. The government should ensure peace in these areas so that these people don't suffer more than they already have, and this can be done only if the government takes proactive measures so as to ensure social justice and inclusive growth for the benefit of the marginalized sections. Dear students, this brings to the end of this module. I hope you all have understood the ideology behind Naxalism and the measures which are taken by the government to tackle Naxal movement. Students, after having a detailed discussion about Naxalism, it is now time to conclude our lecture. The state has to do much more than plan counter-insurgency operations or support violent, vigilant groups to suppress the Naxalite movement. After close examination of the historical and ideological origins of the movement, it is clear that the movement thrives on the dissatisfaction of the marginalized and alienates the population. The socio-economic perspective of Naxalism talks about how the rebel movement is shaped due to the failure of the institutional mechanism and frameworks to deliver socio-economic justice. This article outlines the steps taken by the government, but concedes that it is not enough to overemphasize the law and order approach. A close examination of the movement will enable to understand that the marginalized take up arms only to break down the insensitive establishment which has failed to deliver an egalitarian society. The Naxalite leaders may talk about deliverance of the proliterate from the neoliberalist bogies and the dawn of new democracy. But such phrases mean little to the tribal and landless laborers who find themselves at the receiving end of the state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored exploitation. They are in the battle only because of their disillusionment with the status quo. It is clear that there is a wide chasm between promises and their eventual deliverance until the government implements employment, poverty alleviation and land reform programs. Counter reinsurgency measures cannot be achieved now, and it cannot achieve much later on also. Social justice and inclusive growth are the planks on which the government must build its program. Only with consolidated efforts on the part of the legal and political framework, socio-economic reforms can be implemented and the problem of Naxalism tackled. This brings to an end of today's chapter on Naxalism. I hope now you are familiar with the advent of Naxalism and government's approach in dealing with this problem. Please review the chapter as and when required. I hope you all have understood the underlying concepts of this chapter. Do keep in mind what we have discussed today. I will be back with one more lecture in this series. If you want to learn more and enhance your knowledge, you may log on to our website www.cec.nic.in for MCQs, quizzes, LORs, etc. Thank you for your time today. I will see you in the next lecture. Keep learning and goodbye.